My stepmom showed up on my 1-year sober anniversary to pressure me to start using again. She didn't know our entire family was eavesdropping from the hallway. The door was unlocked and she waltzed right in with a smirk on her face. "Oh, honey, you relapsed? On your anniversary?" Before I could tell her I wasn't high and just tired, she took out a pill bottle. "Here, I brought your favorites. Let's keep this between us." I wanted to cry. But even more than that, I wanted my family to hear what Lilith said when she thought no one was listening. Wow, Dad would be so proud of the woman he married. "Your father?" She spat the words like venom. "Your father? That sack of shit died worried about his junkie son." This was it. "Because of me?" She laughed and the sound made my skin crawl. "No, not because of you. Gosh, you still haven't figured it out, have you?" She swallowed one of the pills before continuing. "Remember when you were 16 and had that panic attack before your driving test?" I nodded, remembering that day perfectly. "What you didn't know was that I crushed an oxy into the tomato soup I gave you. It was your first taste of opioids, courtesy of stepmommy. You're welcome." She was practically glowing with pride. Suddenly, Daddy's anxious little boy had bigger problems than test anxiety. "But I kept having pain after that," I said slowly, leading her deeper. "The chronic pain that started after your wisdom teeth surgery?" She finished, delighted I was finally catching on. "My cousin was the oral surgeon. I told him to nick the nerve during the extraction, just enough damage to cause chronic pain. You needed those pills for legitimate pain, which made it so easy to keep you hooked." The room felt like it was spinning, but I had to keep her talking. "That's why the pain never went away. But what about when I tried to get clean? I'd be doing well, and then suddenly you'd relapse?" Lilith walked closer, waving the pill bottle like a trophy. "I put Xanax in your protein shakes, crushed pills in your food. Remember those family dinners where you couldn't keep your eyes open? Where you'd slur your words even though you swore you didn't remember taking anything?" "Every single one of Grandma's dinners," I responded, making my voice break, continuing my carefully crafted performance. "I'd dose your mashed potatoes, then cry to your grandmother about how hard it was watching you struggle with addiction. She was so worried about the family money going to drugs that she signed everything over to me. I got full control of her estate 2 weeks before she died." Lilith's eyes glittered with something dark. "Of course, she was already on hospice by then. A little extra morphine just helped her along." My hands were shaking now, but I forced out the next question. "You killed her?" Killed is such an ugly word. I expedited the inevitable, just like with your father. She leaned against the counter, casual as if we were discussing the weather. "The night he died, you tried to visit him, remember? But you were so messed up you could barely stand." "I'd only had coffee," I said, my voice breaking for real now. "Coffee with 3 crushed oxys in it," she corrected. "You showed up at the hospital slurring and stumbling. Your dad died thinking his son chose drugs over saying goodbye." Rage filled my bones, but I needed more evidence, so I continued. "After that, everything got worse. I woke up in jail, with assault charges, yes. That was particularly clever of me." She actually looked proud. "I hit myself with a door handle until I had a beautiful black eye, then called 911 screaming that you'd attacked me. That record destroyed your nursing school dreams, didn't it? No hospital would hire someone with a violent history. The hepatitis C," I said, my voice hollow. "The doctor said I must have shared needles, but I never—" "Of course you didn't share needles." She examined her cheap acrylics. "I took a needle from the clinic's medical waste. All it took was 1 stick while you were passed out drunk." I closed my eyes and did what I always do when I'm nervous. I fiddled with my dog's collar that I kept on my keychain. Lilith stepped closer, her eyes lighting up with cruel delight. "You want to know something funny about your precious service dog?" Her voice went soft, almost tender, which made it infinitely worse. "I put Benadryl in his food to make him sleepy. Gave you enough sleeping pills to knock you out cold. Then I strangled him myself and positioned his body next to you. You woke up convinced you'd killed him in a blackout. I watched you sob while you buried him in the backyard, begging a dead dog to forgive you for something I did. The rage was so thick I could taste it, but I had one last question. Why? Why would you do all of this? Why?" She slammed the pill bottle on the counter. "Because you existed. Every time your father chose you over me. Every time he said, 'Let me check with my son first.' Every dollar spent on your therapy instead of our vacation. You were a constant reminder that I was his second choice, that I'd never have him completely to myself." She leaned in close, her breath hot with wine and hatred. "But look at you now. Even sober, you're ruined. The liver damage, the brain damage, the criminal record, it's all permanent." That's when we heard it. Crash. The sound from upstairs shattered her gloating like a hammer through glass. Lilith spun around, stumbling in her heels. Her daughter Sophie stood at the top of the stairs, the party banner pole for my anniversary at her feet where she'd dropped it. Behind her, my entire family crowded the hallway, faces white with shock. Lilith's eyes went wide when she saw everyone standing there. Her face changed from proud to scared in about 2 seconds. I moved fast and got between her and the front door, while my Uncle Julian came into the room behind her with his phone up, already recording everything. Sophie stayed frozen at the top of the stairs looking like she might throw up, her skin so pale I could see her freckles standing out. My hands were shaking bad, but I made them stop and reached for the pill bottle she'd put on the counter. I grabbed a dish towel first and used that to pick it up so I wouldn't mess up any fingerprints or evidence. Lilith saw what I was doing and lunged at me, trying to grab the bottle back. My Aunt Natasha got in her way, putting herself between us and holding up both hands. Natasha's voice came out calm and steady, even though I could see her hands shaking a little. More family members came out from the hallway where they'd been listening, forming a loose half-circle that blocked Lilith from getting to the door, or to me. My cousin Marcus stood near the kitchen entrance. My other cousin Elena positioned herself by the window. Everyone looked shocked, but nobody was leaving and nobody was letting Lilith leave either. I pulled my phone out with my free hand, the one not holding the towel with the pill bottle. My fingers felt clumsy, and I almost dropped it, but I managed to unlock the screen and dial 911. The operator answered on the second ring, and I tried to keep my voice level. I told her I needed police for attempted distribution of controlled substances with multiple witnesses present. She asked me to stay on the line, and I said I would. Lilith started screaming that I was lying, that this was all a big misunderstanding, that her drug addict stepson was trying to frame her. Julian kept his phone camera pointed right at her, recording every word she said and every move she made. The 911 operator asked me to describe what was happening, and I did, explaining as calmly as I could while Lilith kept yelling in the background. Sophie made this horrible sobbing sound and collapsed onto the stairs. Natasha went to her immediately, sitting down next to the girl and wrapping an arm around her shoulders. Natasha kept Sophie close, but positioned so the rest of us could still see them both. I realized right then that Sophie was a victim too. She was just a kid who'd found out her mom was a monster. My anger shifted a little bit, adding in this need to protect Sophie from more trauma, even though I was furious at what Lilith had done. The other family members formed a tighter circle in the living room. Nobody said much, but everyone stayed put, united in making sure Lilith couldn't leave before the cops got there. The 911 operator told me officers were on the way and asked me to stay on the line. I could hear Lilith still yelling about how I was framing her, how I was a liar, how she'd never done anything wrong. 2 patrol officers showed up in maybe 15 minutes. I handed over the pill bottle still wrapped in the dish towel and explained what happened. Julian came forward with his phone and offered to send them the recording he'd made. One officer took the bottle and bagged it as evidence, while the other one started writing down names of everyone who'd heard the confession. They separated us into different rooms to take statements. I ended up in the living room with one officer while Lilith got taken to the kitchen with the other one. I could hear her through the wall, her voice going back and forth between crying and yelling. She kept saying I was a drug addict trying to frame her, that I was lying, that none of it was true. The officer with me was patient and thorough, asking detailed questions about what Lilith had said and what had happened. When he finished taking my statement, he explained that based on the witnesses and physical evidence, they could help me file for an emergency protective order right away. I agreed immediately even though my hands were shaking, so bad I could barely hold the pen. The officer walked me through the paperwork, explaining that the order would keep Lilith away from me until a court hearing could be scheduled. The other officer brought Lilith out from the kitchen and served her with the protective order before they took her for more questioning at the station. The look on her face when she realized she couldn't come near me anymore made my stomach flip. Part of me felt satisfied, but another part felt scared because I knew she'd be even more angry now. After the police left with Lilith, I gathered my closest family in the living room. Uncle Julian and Aunt Natasha sat on the couch. 2 of my cousins pulled up chairs. I explained everything Lilith had confessed to, filling in details they might have missed from the hallway. We went through the timeline together, making sure everyone understood what happened when. We talked about how to support Sophie since she was caught between her mother and the truth. Julian suggested we write down everything we remembered while it was still fresh. Natasha said Sophie could stay with them for a while if needed. Everyone left around midnight. The apartment felt too quiet after they were gone. I sat on the couch staring at my phone for probably 20 minutes before I finally called Seamus. When he answered, I told him the stress and adrenaline were making me want pills, so bad I could barely think straight. The craving felt like it was eating me from the inside out. Seamus talked me through breathing exercises over the phone. He reminded me that using now would give Lilith exactly what she wanted. He said it would destroy my credibility as a witness. His voice stayed calm and steady while I tried to breathe like he told me to. I made it through the night without using, but it was close. Closer than I wanted to admit. I ended up sleeping on the couch with all the lights on because my bedroom felt unsafe somehow. The next morning, my phone rang at 8:30. A woman introduced herself as Detective Trish Marston, the investigator assigned to my case. Her voice sounded calm and professional. She explained that she specialized in cases involving poisoning and elder abuse. She wanted to schedule a formal interview for that afternoon at the police station. Something about her tone helped me feel more grounded. I spent the morning writing down every detail I could remember about Lilith's confession and the years of weird symptoms I'd had. At the police station that afternoon, Detective Marston sat across from me in a small interview room. She explained gently that we had some challenges with evidence. The confession about the current attempted distribution was strong because we had witnesses and the pill bottle, but proving all the historical poisoning would be much harder. Most of the physical evidence was gone or too old to test properly. I felt my hopes start to deflate like a balloon losing air, but then she quickly added that the current charge was serious enough to go after hard. She said we could build a pattern case if we were smart about it and strategic with what evidence we did have. I leaned forward and my hands gripped the edge of the table. Detective Marston needed to know about the dog. She watched me carefully as I explained how Lilith confessed to strangling him and making it look like I killed him during a blackout. Her expression changed. Something harder settled into her features and her jaw tightened. She asked if I would consent to exhuming his remains for forensic examination. A veterinary pathologist could confirm strangulation if the evidence was still there. It would prove Lilith's confession and show her pattern of cruelty. The thought of disturbing his grave made my chest hurt. But he deserved justice too. I agreed immediately. Detective Marston nodded and made a note on her pad. She said she would arrange everything and keep me updated on the timeline. The exhumation would take a few weeks to coordinate, but she would handle the details. I left the police station feeling drained and drove straight to Uncle Julian's house where the family was gathering. Everyone wanted to talk about what happened and figure out next steps. We sat around the dining room table with coffee and leftover cake from my anniversary party that never really happened. Some of my relatives started talking about the publicity. They worried about court proceedings and what the neighbors would think. My cousin Miranda kept saying this would affect the whole family's reputation. Uncle Julian cut her off hard. His voice went sharp and he leaned across the table. He said protecting Sophie and getting justice for what was done to me mattered more than what anyone thought. The room went quiet. Aunt Natasha reached over and squeezed my hand. We all agreed that Sophie's well-being had to be the priority. She shouldn't be forced to testify if it would hurt her more, even if keeping her off the stand made the case weaker. Everyone nodded and the tension eased a little. We talked for another hour about who would go to court hearings and how to support each other through whatever came next. By the time I got home, it was past midnight. I tried to sleep, but my brain wouldn't shut off. Every detail Lilith confessed to kept playing on repeat in my head. The tomato soup when I was 16, the wisdom teeth surgery that wasn't an accident, the protein shakes I drank every morning thinking they were helping me recover. I connected each memory to what she told me and realized how many times I blamed myself for things she did. The panic attack started around 2 in the morning. My heart raced and I couldn't catch my breath. I got up and checked the locks on my front door. Then I checked them again. And again. Every 20 minutes I walked through my apartment making sure the windows were locked and the door was secure. I kept imagining Lilith showing up and violating the protective order. My hands shook as I twisted the deadbolt for the 10th time. Around 3, I finally admitted I needed help. Professional help. This was too big to handle alone. I texted Seamus asking if he knew a therapist who worked with trauma. He responded within minutes even though it was the middle of the night. He sent me 2 names and said both were good with addiction recovery and trauma. I saved the information and managed to sleep for a few hours on the couch with all the lights on. 3 days later, I sat in a therapist's office filling out intake paperwork. Antonia Co came highly recommended according to Seamus. Her office was small and comfortable with soft lighting and plants on the windowsill. She invited me to sit in a chair across from her desk. Antonia was probably in her 40s with short dark hair and kind eyes. She asked detailed questions about my history and current symptoms. I told her about the addiction and the year of sobriety, about Lilith's confession and the investigation, about the panic attacks and the constant fear. She listened without interrupting and took notes on a tablet. After about 40 minutes, she explained her approach. We would work on 2 main goals. First, establishing healthy boundaries so I could protect myself emotionally. Second, preparing me to testify without falling apart on the witness stand. She said trauma made people dissociate or get overwhelmed with emotion. We needed to practice grounding techniques so I could stay present and credible. I left her office feeling something I hadn't felt in days. Maybe hope, maybe just relief that someone understood what I was dealing with. I scheduled weekly sessions and drove home thinking I might actually get through this without destroying my sobriety or losing my mind completely. Detective Marston called the next week to tell me she arranged a meeting with the prosecutor. His name was Julian Beck, and he worked as an assistant district attorney. We met at his office downtown in a building that smelled like old coffee and cleaning products. Beck was younger than I expected, maybe early 30s with glasses and a sharp suit. He shook my hand and gestured to a chair in front of his desk. Then he started asking questions. Hard questions. What could I prove versus what did I only know from Lilith's confession? What physical evidence existed? Which witnesses actually saw something versus just heard about it later? I answered as honestly as I could. He listened and made notes, and his face stayed neutral the whole time. After an hour, he leaned back in his chair. He explained that the pill bottle and witness testimony gave us a solid case for attempted distribution. That charge would stick, but charges related to the historical poisoning would depend on what other evidence we could find. Most of it happened too long ago. The drugs were out of my system. The food was gone. We had Lilith's confession, but that alone might not be enough. I appreciated his honesty, even though it wasn't what I wanted to hear. At least he was being straight with me instead of making promises he couldn't keep. The next day, I went to the courthouse to file for a longer restraining order. The emergency one would expire soon. I brought copies of the police report and statements from family members who witnessed the confession. My lawyer met me there. We spent 2 hours documenting every interaction I ever had with Lilith. Text messages where she asked to meet up, emails about family events, voicemails that seemed innocent but felt manipulative now that I knew the truth. My lawyer organized everything into a folder and helped me fill out the petition. The clerk at the window reviewed the paperwork and stamped it with a date. She scheduled a hearing for 2 weeks out. She told me to keep detailed records of any contact Lilith made. If she violated the emergency order, I should call the police immediately and document everything. I left the courthouse with a folder full of papers and instructions. My hands were steadier than they had been in days. 2 weeks into the investigation, Detective Marston called with news. They executed a search warrant on Lilith's house. Officers seized multiple prescription bottles, financial documents, and her computer. Marston sounded cautiously optimistic on the phone. Some of the medications they found weren't prescribed to Lilith. The bottles had other people's names on them. The financial records showed suspicious transfers around the time my grandmother died. Large amounts of money moving between accounts right before and after she signed everything over to Lilith. I felt something shift in my chest. Vindication, maybe. Or just relief that investigators were taking this seriously and finding real evidence. Marston said the computer forensics would take a few weeks. They were looking for searches related to drugs or poisoning, any communication with her cousin, the oral surgeon, anything that supported the pattern of behavior she confessed to. I thanked her and hung up. For the first time since this started, I felt like maybe the system would actually work. Sophie gave her statement to Detective Marston a few days later. Uncle Julian and a victim advocate were there to support her. Marston called me afterward to give me a summary. Sophie confirmed she witnessed her mother crushing pills and putting them in food multiple times. Lilith always told her it was vitamins or supplements for my health. Sophie believed her because why wouldn't she? She was just a kid watching her mom take care of her stepbrother. Marston said Sophie was clearly struggling. She loved her mother, but she was horrified by what she did. The detective handled her gently and got the information she needed without pushing too hard. I felt grateful Sophie was protected through this process. She showed more courage than most adults would in her situation. Speaking up against your own mother takes guts. I texted Uncle Julian to thank him for being there with her. He responded that Sophie was staying strong but having nightmares. We all needed to support her however we could. The exhumation happened at the end of week 2. I couldn't bring myself to be there. Detective Marston called to tell me they were sending the remains to a forensic veterinary pathologist, someone who specialized in figuring out how animals died. The waiting period for results would be several weeks, maybe a month or more depending on the lab's workload, but knowing someone was finally investigating what really happened to him helped. The guilt I carried for a year started to feel different. Not gone, but lighter somehow. Like maybe I could forgive myself once we had proof I didn't kill him. I spent that evening looking at old photos of him on my phone, his brown eyes and floppy ears, the way he used to rest his head on my lap when I was having a bad day. Lilith took him from me and made me believe I was a monster. That was almost worse than killing him herself. I met with the victim advocate the following week. Her name was Judy Calderon and she worked for the county. Her office was in a building near the courthouse with posters about domestic violence and victim rights on the walls. Judy walked me through what to expect from the court process: arraignment, preliminary hearings, possibly a trial. She connected me with resources for medical bill assistance and counseling services. Then she explained my rights as a victim. I could give an impact statement if the case went to sentencing. I could be notified of court dates and any changes to Lilith's custody status. I had the right to be heard. We spent an hour creating a safety plan in case Lilith violated the protective order. Where I would go, who I would call, what evidence I should gather. Judy gave me her direct number and told me to reach out anytime. Having someone whose entire job was helping me navigate the system made me feel less alone. Like maybe I was capable of seeing this through to the end. By week 3, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Old high school friends I hadn't heard from in 5 years were suddenly texting, asking if I was okay. Neighbors I barely knew were stopping me in the parking lot with concerned looks. Someone's cousin worked at the courthouse and word was spreading fast about Lilith's arrest. I met with Judy again, and she sat across from me with her notebook open. She explained that I needed to control the story before rumors filled in the gaps. I could choose who to talk to and what to say. I decided to keep it simple. My closest friends got the basic truth that there was an investigation, and I was cooperating with police. Everyone else got a short text saying I couldn't discuss details of an ongoing case. It felt better having a plan instead of just reacting to every message. Detective Marston called me 3 days later with an update about the oral surgeon. She'd tracked down Lilith's cousin who did my wisdom teeth extraction and went to interview him. The second she mentioned my name and the date of the surgery, he got defensive. He insisted he followed proper procedures, and any complications were normal risks of the surgery. Detective Marston said his reaction raised red flags. Most doctors would pull records and review the case if there were concerns. Instead, he immediately denied wrongdoing before she even accused him of anything. She was pulling his surgical records and licensing history to see if there were other complaints or unusual complication rates. I felt anger burning in my chest, knowing this person deliberately hurt me because Lilith asked him to, but I channeled it into helping Detective Marston understand the timeline. I walked her through when the pain started, how long it lasted, what medications I was prescribed. She took notes on everything and added it to her growing file. I requested copies of my dental records from the oral surgeon's office the next day. The office manager seemed confused why I wanted records from 6 years ago, but she processed the request. 2 weeks later, a thick envelope arrived with all my surgical notes and post-op records. I spread the papers across my kitchen table and started reading. The procedure was performed by Lilith's cousin, just like she said. The notes showed complications during the surgery with damage to the lingual nerve. But the surgeon attributed it to patient factors like my anatomy being difficult. I looked up normal wisdom tooth extraction outcomes online. Nerve damage happened in less than 2% of cases. The pain I experienced for years afterward wasn't normal. Detective Marston came to my apartment to review the records with me. She photographed every page and added them to the evidence file. She said the records showed a pattern of Lilith using medical situations to keep me dependent on pain medication. It was systematic sabotage of my health documented in official records. The hospice records for my grandmother arrived after Detective Marston filed a formal request with the facility. She called me to her office to go through them together. The records showed my grandmother's morphine doses during her final week. There were unexplained spikes in administration that weren't ordered by her doctor. Some doses were given at odd times, like 3 in the morning when regular rounds wouldn't happen. There were also gaps in the documentation where doses should have been recorded but weren't. Detective Marston's face got dark as she reviewed the pages. She explained that proving Lilith killed my grandmother would be nearly impossible without a confession or witness. Too much time had passed. The hospice staff from back then had moved on to other jobs. The morphine could have been given by any number of people with access to the medication room, but the records established that something suspicious happened during my grandmother's final days. They showed opportunity and access even if we couldn't prove intent. Financial records came next after the detective subpoenaed them from the bank. My grandmother signed over control of her entire estate to Lilith just 2 weeks before she died. The timing was suspicious because my grandmother had been in hospice for over a month by then. Why would she suddenly transfer everything so close to the end? The documents showed my grandmother's signature, but it looked shaky and unclear. Detective Marston brought the records to ADA Beck's office, and I went with her. Beck spread the papers across his desk and studied them carefully. He confirmed they established a clear financial motive for Lilith wanting my grandmother dead. My grandmother's estate was worth over $400,000 between her house and savings. Lilith got control of all of it right before my grandmother died. But Beck cautioned that motive alone wasn't enough for criminal charges. We needed evidence that Lilith actually killed her. The financial records helped build the pattern, but they didn't prove murder. I started preparing for grand jury testimony the following week. Ada Beck scheduled 3 sessions to coach me on how to present my story. Then, he explained that the grand jury would decide if there was enough evidence to indict Lilith on criminal charges. My job was to be credible and factual. I couldn't speculate about things I didn't personally witness. I had to stick to what I knew for certain. We practiced answering hostile questions. Beck played the role of a skeptical juror, asking why I didn't report Lilith sooner, or why I kept accepting food from her if I suspected something. The practice made my anxiety spike, but it also helped me feel more prepared. I learned to pause before answering instead of getting defensive. I practiced keeping my voice steady even when talking about painful topics. Beck said I was doing well but needed to be even more concise. Grand juries moved fast, and I had to make my points clearly without rambling. Detective Marston called me a week later with news about my father's hospital chart. She'd obtained the records from the night he died, and they confirmed what Lilith confessed. The nursing notes showed I visited the hospital that evening around 8 p.m. Multiple staff members documented that I appeared intoxicated and unable to communicate clearly. One nurse wrote that I was slurring my words and unsteady on my feet. Another noted I seemed devastated but incoherent. The timing lined up perfectly with Lilith drugging my coffee before I tried to see my father. I was poisoned and everyone thought I was high. Reading those notes broke something open inside me. Hospital staff witnessed my father's final moments, and they all believed I chose drugs over saying goodbye. They documented it in official records that would follow me forever. I had to leave Beck's office because I couldn't stop crying. I sat in my car in the parking garage for an hour just trying to breathe. The shame of that night had lived in me for so long. Now I knew it wasn't my fault, but the damage was already done. Ada Beck called me back to his office 2 days later with disappointing news. He explained that he wouldn't be pursuing homicide charges related to my father or grandmother at this time. The evidence was too circumstantial, and too much time had passed. Without a body to exhume or witnesses who saw Lilith administer the drugs, we couldn't prove murder beyond reasonable doubt. The prosecution would focus on 3 charges. The attempted distribution charge from the night of the confession when Lilith brought pills to my apartment, the animal cruelty charge related to killing my dog, and potentially fraud charges related to how she obtained my grandmother's estate. I felt frustrated that Lilith might not face consequences for the worst things she did. But Beck explained the legal limitations, and I had to accept we could only work with what we could prove in court. Child Protective Services contacted Detective Marston the next week with concerns about Sophie. Her mother was under investigation for poisoning, and her father wasn't in the picture. A CPS caseworker named Miranda came to meet with our family at Uncle Julian's house. She asked questions about our family structure and who could provide a safe home for Sophie. Uncle Julian and Aunt Natasha offered to take Sophie temporarily if needed. They had a spare bedroom, and Sophie already felt comfortable with them. Sophie sat on the couch looking small and scared. She was caught between wanting to believe her mother wasn't as bad as the evidence showed and knowing what she heard that night. Miranda asked Sophie gentle questions about how she was feeling and if she felt safe. Sophie's answers were quiet but honest. She said she loved her mother, but she was afraid of her now. The stress of the CPS situation triggered something in me a few days later. I was driving home from work and suddenly found myself in a pharmacy parking lot. I didn't remember deciding to go there. I just ended up there with my car in the park and my hands shaking on the steering wheel. The craving hit me so hard I could barely breathe. I wanted pills so badly I could taste them. I wanted the numbness and the quiet in my head. I sat there seriously considering walking inside and trying to get a prescription somehow. My phone was in my hand before I realized I'd picked it up. I called Seamus in a panic. He answered on the second ring, and I could barely get the words out about where I was and what I was thinking. He told me to stay on the line, and 15 minutes later his car pulled up next to mine. He got out and climbed into my passenger seat. We sat there together while he talked me through the craving. He reminded me that Lilith spent years trying to destroy me. Staying sober was the ultimate proof that she failed. If I used now, I'd be giving her exactly what she wanted. His words cut through the fog enough that I could start my car. I followed him back to his place, and we sat in his kitchen drinking coffee until the worst of it passed. He didn't judge me or act disappointed. He just stayed with me until I was steady enough to drive home. The next morning, I sat in Antonia's office, and we went through the practical steps I needed to take to feel safer. She pulled out a notepad, and we made a list together. First thing was blocking Lilith's number on my phone and all my social media accounts. Antonia explained that any contact Lilith needed to make could go through Judy or my lawyer, which meant I wouldn't have to see her name pop up on my screen and trigger a panic response. I did it right there in her office, watching Lilith's contact disappear from my phone. The second thing was changing my routines. I'd been going to the same grocery store at the same time every week, the same coffee shop every morning, the same gym on the same days. Antonia pointed out that predictable patterns made it easy for Lilith to show up and violate the protective order. So I switched grocery stores, found a new coffee place on the other side of town, and changed my gym schedule to random times. The third thing was installing a security camera at my apartment entrance. Antonia knew a guy who did installations cheap, and I had it set up within 3 days. Having that camera recording everyone who came to my door helped me sleep better at night. These weren't big dramatic moves, but they were concrete actions I could take, and taking action made me feel less like a victim waiting for the next bad thing to happen. 2 weeks after implementing these boundaries, I got served with legal papers at work. A coworker brought them to my desk looking uncomfortable, and I opened the envelope right there. Lilith's lawyer had filed a petition claiming I was harassing her and trying to damage her reputation with false accusations. The petition requested that the protective order be dropped immediately. Reading through the distortions and outright lies made my hands shake with rage. According to her lawyer, I was a troubled addict with a history of violence who was targeting my stepmother because she'd tried to help me get clean. The document painted me as unstable and vindictive, turning everything upside down. I called Judy from the parking lot, and she could hear the panic in my voice. She told me to come to her office right away, and when I got there, she read through the petition carefully. Then she looked up at me and explained this was a common defense tactic meant to intimidate victims and muddy the waters. She'd seen it dozens of times before. The goal was to make me feel attacked and scared, to make me want to back down and drop the whole thing. But we had the police report documenting what Lilith said that night, and we had statements from multiple family members who heard the confession. Judy assured me the petition wouldn't work. A hearing was scheduled for the following week, and she immediately contacted ADA Beck to prepare a response. Beck worked fast, filing paperwork that cited the police report and all the witness statements supporting my version of events. He included photos of the pill bottle Lilith brought and the recording Julian made on his phone. The response brief was solid, and Judy felt confident going into the hearing. The courthouse was cold that morning, and I sat in the hallway outside the courtroom with Uncle Julian and Judy. Lilith arrived with her lawyer, and she wouldn't look at me, which was fine because I couldn't stand to look at her either. When we went inside, the judge called the case, and both lawyers stood up to present their arguments. Lilith's lawyer went first, painting this picture of me as a dangerous addict who was making up stories to get revenge. He talked about my criminal record and my history of substance abuse, like those facts automatically made me a liar. Then Ada Beck stood up and walked the judge through the evidence. He started with the police report from the night officers responded to my apartment. He described how multiple family members heard Lilith confess to years of systematic poisoning. He presented the witness statements one by one, showing that 8 different people heard the same confession. Then he showed the judge photos of the pill bottle Lilith brought to my apartment that night, the physical evidence that started this whole investigation. The judge listened carefully and asked a few questions about the timeline and the witnesses. Then she reviewed the police report herself, taking several minutes to read through it. When she looked up, she denied Lilith's petition completely. She stated clearly that the evidence supported reasonable fear of harm and the protective order would remain in full effect. Lilith's face went bright red, and she whispered something angry to her lawyer. I felt this wave of relief wash over me, knowing that at least one part of the system was working the way it should. The judge wasn't buying Lilith's lies, and the protective order would keep her away from me. 5 weeks after they exhumed my dog's remains, Detective Marston called me at work. I stepped outside to take the call, and she got right to the point. The forensic veterinary pathologist had completed her examination and found evidence consistent with ligature strangulation. The hyoid bone showed damage that matched what you'd see in a strangulation case, and there were soft tissue patterns that supported it too. Detective Marston explained carefully that the report couldn't be 100% definitive after this much time because of decomposition, but the findings were probative, and they supported Lilith's confession about strangling him. I started crying right there in the parking lot behind my work building. Detective Marston stayed on the line and let me cry without trying to rush me or make me feel better with empty words. After a minute, I was able to talk again, and I thanked her for pushing to get the exhumation done. She said she was glad we had this evidence because it proved I didn't kill him and that he died because of Lilith's cruelty, not my negligence. That validation meant everything to me. For a whole year, I'd carried the guilt of thinking I killed him during a blackout. Now I knew the truth, and even though it hurt to know what really happened, at least I wasn't responsible for his death. 3 days after the vet report came back, Detective Marston called again with bigger news. The district attorney's office had filed criminal charges against Lilith. She listed them out over the phone, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. Attempted distribution of a controlled substance for bringing pills to my apartment that night. Animal cruelty resulting in death based on the forensic vet report, and Lilith's confession. Fraud related to the estate transfer documents, and how Lilith got control of my grandmother's money. Each charge felt like a small piece of justice finally arriving. I felt this complicated mix of relief and vindication and lingering frustration all at once. The charges didn't cover everything Lilith did to me over the years. They didn't cover the poisoning that destroyed my health or the false assault charges that ruined my nursing career. They didn't cover killing my father and grandmother, but at least she was finally being held accountable for something. Detective Marston explained that proving the historical poisoning would have been nearly impossible without physical evidence, and the homicides were too circumstantial to prosecute. These 3 charges were what we could prove beyond reasonable doubt, and they were serious felonies that could result in real prison time. The arraignment happened the following week, and I sat in the courtroom gallery with Aunt Natasha. Lilith stood before the judge in an orange jumpsuit looking smaller than I remembered. Her lawyer entered not guilty pleas to all 3 charges, which didn't surprise anyone. The judge reviewed the charges and the evidence summary that ADA Beck had prepared. Then the judge set bail at $50,000. I thought maybe that would keep her locked up for a while, but Lilith's family posted the bail immediately. Within 2 hours, she walked out of the courthouse wearing regular clothes again. I saw her leave through the front doors with her sister and her lawyer, and my stomach dropped even though I knew the protective order was still in place, and she wasn't supposed to come near me. Just seeing her free and walking around made me feel unsafe all over again. Judy reminded me that bail is standard for non-violent felonies, and that Lilith would have GPS monitoring and strict conditions. But logic didn't make the fear go away. That weekend, our family held a meeting at Uncle Julian's house to talk about court attendance and support strategies. Everyone sat around the dining room table, and we acknowledged that the trial process could take months, maybe even a year. We needed to pace ourselves to avoid burnout because this was going to be a marathon, not a sprint. Uncle Julian suggested we rotate who attends court hearings so that I always have support, but no one person has to carry the entire burden of being there every single time. Aunt Natasha agreed and pulled out a calendar. We mapped out the upcoming court dates that Ada Beck had given us and started assigning people to each one. My cousin Sarah volunteered for the preliminary hearing. Uncle Julian took the pretrial conference. Aunt Natasha said she'd be there for the trial itself no matter what. Everyone committed to checking in regularly about how we were handling the stress, and we set up a group chat specifically for court updates so nobody felt left out of the loop. It felt good to have this structure and support system in place. Monday morning, I had to have an uncomfortable conversation with my boss about needing time off for court appearances. I sat in his office and tried to explain the situation without going into too much detail. I told him I was involved in a criminal case as a victim, and I'd need flexible scheduling for court dates over the next several months. He asked what kind of case, and I had to tell him it involved my stepmother and charges related to assault and fraud. I watched his face change as I talked. He stayed polite and understanding on the surface, telling me the company would work with me and I could take whatever time I needed, but I could feel the subtle shift in how he saw me once he knew about my addiction history and that I was involved in a criminal case. The stigma was there even though he was trying to be supportive. After that meeting, he was more distant with me. He'd walk past my desk without stopping to chat like he used to. He didn't invite me to the team lunch the following week. I had to accept that some people will never fully separate me from my past struggles, no matter how long I stay sober or how much I rebuild my life. It hurt, but I couldn't let it derail me. My therapy sessions with Antonia shifted focus completely to preparing me for testimony. She explained that I needed to be able to tell my story on the witness stand without dissociating or becoming so emotional that I lost credibility. We practiced grounding techniques I could use during testimony, like pressing my feet into the floor and focusing on my breath. She had me sit in a chair and pretend it was the witness stand while she asked me questions. At first, I'd start crying or my mind would go blank when she asked about the dog or my father, but we practiced over and over until I could answer clearly while staying present. Antonia helped me understand that showing emotion was okay and even humanizing, but I needed to stay present enough to answer questions clearly and not let the defense attorney derail me with hostile questioning. She warned me that the defense would try to attack my credibility by bringing up my addiction history and criminal record. We practiced responding to those attacks without getting defensive or falling apart. She taught me to pause before answering, to take a breath, to acknowledge the question without letting it shake me. The preparation was exhausting but necessary. 2 months into the investigation, Ada Beck called to tell me about evidence they'd found in Lilith's phone records. The search warrant had given them access to her text messages, and they'd found conversations with someone about obtaining prescription medications. The language was careful and ambiguous enough to have plausible deniability, but it was damaging in context. The messages referenced things like getting the usual and same as last time without explicitly naming drugs. There were also Venmo payments that corresponded with the message timestamps, showing money changing hands right after these conversations. Beck explained he was cautiously optimistic that these messages helped establish Lilith's pattern of obtaining and distributing controlled substances over time. It wasn't as strong as we'd like because she never explicitly said what she was buying, but combined with everything else, it painted a picture of someone who regularly acquired pills illegally. The defense would argue the messages were about something innocent, but a jury would see through that. Beck warned me not to get my hopes too high because circumstantial evidence like this could go either way, but at least it was something more to add to the case file. A week later, Detective Marston called with news that made my hands shake. She'd checked with every pharmacy in a 30-mile radius and tracked down the lot number from the pill bottle Lilith brought to my apartment. The pills came from a batch prescribed to an elderly patient who died 6 months ago. The pharmacy records showed the deceased patient's name, and the prescription was never transferred to Lilith or anyone in her family. Detective Marston explained this meant Lilith either took the pills from the dead person's house or got them some other way, which helped prove she was distributing controlled substances she had no legal right to possess. I felt a surge of hope knowing we had concrete evidence that tied directly to that night. The next day, I spent 8 hours at Beck's office going over trial preparation until my brain felt like mush. He sat across from me with a legal pad and didn't sugarcoat anything. He told me to stick to facts I could verify with my own eyes and ears, avoid guessing about Lilith's motives or things I didn't personally see, and never add details or make things sound worse than they were, because the defense would use any tiny inconsistency to make me look like a liar. We practiced my testimony over and over, with Beck playing the role of hostile defense attorney and asking brutal questions about my addiction history and criminal record. By hour 6, I could tell my story clearly without falling apart or getting defensive. Beck made me repeat certain answers until they were simple and direct. He drilled into me that showing emotion was fine, but I had to stay present enough to actually answer the questions being asked. The practice was exhausting, but I left feeling more prepared than I'd expected. 3 days later, a thick envelope arrived at Beck's office from Lilith's attorney. Inside was a plea offer proposing reduced charges in exchange for a guilty plea. Beck called a family meeting to discuss it, and opinions split immediately. 2 of my cousins wanted to accept it to avoid the trauma and uncertainty of a trial. They argued that getting any conviction was better than risking an acquittal. Uncle Julian and Aunt Natasha felt the reduced charges were too light for what Lilith actually did. I sat there listening to everyone debate while my stomach twisted into knots. Beck laid out the pros and cons in his measured way. A plea deal guaranteed some level of accountability and avoided the risk of losing at trial, but it likely meant lighter sentencing than we'd get with a guilty verdict. He explained that trials were unpredictable and juries could surprise you either way. The offer on the table would drop the animal cruelty charge entirely and reduce the distribution charge to simple possession. I felt sick thinking about Lilith getting away with killing my dog without any consequences. That night I barely slept, going over the decision from every angle. The next morning I called Beck and told him to reject the current offer. I explained that any future deal had to include a guilty plea to the animal cruelty charge at minimum. I needed Lilith held accountable for strangling my dog and making me believe I killed him during a blackout. That psychological torture was one of the cruelest things she did to me. Beck respected my decision and said he'd communicate our position to the defense. He warned me this probably meant we were heading to trial, but he understood why the dog mattered so much. 2 days after that, Sophie called Uncle Julian in tears. She'd been scrolling through old photos on her phone and found something from 8 months ago. The photo showed my kitchen counter with what looked like white powder residue near my protein shaker bottle. The timestamp proved it was from back when I was still living in the fog of unexplained relapses. Sophie wrote out a statement explaining she took the photo because the powder looked weird, but Lilith told her it was just protein supplement that hadn't mixed right. Uncle Julian drove her straight to the police station, where she turned over the photo and statement to Detective Marston. The detective called me that evening to say the photo wasn't definitive proof by itself, but it backed up the pattern of Lilith putting substances in my food and drinks. Every piece of evidence helped build the bigger picture. The relief I felt knowing Sophie was brave enough to come forward again almost made me cry. A week later, an envelope arrived at my apartment from Lilith's defense attorney. Inside was a letter warning that if Sophie testified at trial, they would aggressively challenge her credibility. The letter spelled out their strategy in cold legal language. They'd point out she was a minor with obvious bias against her mother. They'd suggest family members had coached her on what to say. They'd imply she was making things up to stay in Uncle Julian's house instead of going home. Reading it made my blood boil, but it also terrified me. Beck called the same day to discuss the letter. He explained that putting Sophie on the stand could traumatize her, and the defense would definitely be brutal during cross-examination. He said child witnesses were vulnerable, and defense attorneys often went hard trying to break them down or confuse them. I sat there holding the phone and feeling torn apart. I wanted justice, but not at the cost of destroying Sophie. She'd already been through too much because her mother was a monster. That night, I made the hardest decision of the whole process. I called Beck and asked him to minimize how much we relied on Sophie's testimony. I told him to adjust the trial strategy to focus more on physical evidence, expert witnesses, and the statements from adult family members who heard the confession. Beck agreed immediately and said he'd been thinking the same thing. He explained we could still use Sophie's photo and written statement without making her testify in person. I called Uncle Julian after to explain my decision. He supported it completely and said protecting Sophie's mental health mattered more than getting a conviction. His voice was thick with emotion when he thanked me for thinking of her first. The next day, Beck called with the adjusted prosecution strategy. They were narrowing focus to the attempted distribution charge from the night of the confession and the animal cruelty charge. The fraud count related to the estate transfer would be held in reserve depending on how things went at trial. Beck explained this streamlined approach made the case stronger and more focused. It avoided overwhelming the jury with too many complicated historical claims that were harder to prove. I felt disappointed we weren't pursuing everything, but I understood the reasoning. Sometimes you had to be strategic instead of trying to win every battle at once. That same week, I met with a probate attorney to discuss challenging the estate transfer. She reviewed the timeline and documents I'd gathered. We filed a civil petition arguing that Lilith got the estate transfer through undue influence, while my grandmother was heavily medicated and dying. The attorney explained we had a decent case given the suspicious timing and Lilith's criminal charges. The court issued a preliminary order freezing some of the estate assets pending a full hearing. The hearing wouldn't happen for several months, but at least Lilith couldn't spend or hide everything while we fought it out. Knowing my grandmother's money was protected felt like a small victory. The following week, our family gathered for mediation about Sophie's temporary placement. A social worker facilitated the discussion, while Sophie sat between Uncle Julian and Aunt Natasha, looking small and scared. After 2 hours of negotiation, we reached an agreement. Sophie would stay with Uncle Julian and Aunt Natasha, with supervised visits from Lilith, until the criminal case was resolved. Sophie's shoulders relaxed when the decision was announced. She looked relieved to be somewhere stable and away from her mother's chaos. After the mediation ended, I pulled Sophie aside and told her none of this was her fault. I said she did the right thing by telling the truth even though it was hard. She hugged me tight and started crying. I could see the weight she was carrying and wished I could take it from her. But all I could do was promise to be there whenever she needed me and make sure she knew she was safe now. 2 weeks later, I sat in the courthouse conference room with Beck for the pre-trial hearing. The judge reviewed stacks of legal briefs while Lilith's defense attorney argued about what evidence could be presented. The defense wanted to block any mention of my father's or grandmother's deaths, claiming it was prejudicial since Lilith wasn't charged with those crimes. Beck countered that the pattern of behavior Lilith confessed to was relevant context for understanding her actions. The judge listened to both sides and made notes on a yellow legal pad. After 30 minutes of back-and-forth arguments, she announced her ruling. We could reference the pattern of poisoning Lilith confessed to, but couldn't make specific accusations about deaths without additional evidence. Family members who heard the confession could testify about what they witnessed. Beck seemed satisfied when we left the courtroom. He told me the ruling gave us enough to show the jury who Lilith really was, without overreaching on unprovable claims. I felt relieved knowing the confession wouldn't be completely blocked from evidence. The following week, the defense filed another motion, trying to suppress Lilith's statements entirely. They argued she made those statements under duress and without being read her rights. Beck filed a response brief explaining that Miranda warnings only apply to police custody, not private conversations in someone's home. The hearing happened on a Thursday morning with the same judge presiding. Lilith's attorney claimed my family created a hostile environment that forced her to confess. Beck pointed out that Lilith came to my apartment voluntarily and spoke freely without any threats or coercion. The judge ruled that statements overheard by family members in a private home were admissible since Lilith wasn't in custody at the time. However, she limited which parts of the confession could be repeated to avoid unfair prejudice. Beck would need to be selective about what statements to present at trial. I left the courthouse feeling cautiously optimistic that we still had a strong case despite the limitations. That afternoon, I met with Antonia for a therapy session focused entirely on courtroom preparation. She had me sit in a chair and visualize being on the witness stand while she asked questions. We practiced grounding techniques I could use if I started feeling overwhelmed during testimony. She taught me to press my feet firmly into the floor and focus on my breathing when anxiety spiked. We identified specific physical sensations that signaled I was getting too stressed. Tightness in my chest meant I needed to slow down and breathe. Shaking hands meant I should ask for water. Racing thoughts meant I should pause before answering. Antonia reminded me that asking for a break didn't make me weak or less believable. She said showing some emotion was okay, and even made me more human to the jury. The key was staying present enough to answer questions clearly, without getting so upset I couldn't function. We practiced for 2 hours until I felt more confident about handling the pressure. The trial started on a freezing morning in late November, exactly 18 weeks after the night Lilith confessed. I arrived at the courthouse with Uncle Julian and Natasha, both of them dressed formally for the occasion. We went through security and found seats in the gallery behind the prosecution table. Beck wore a dark suit and carried a leather briefcase full of documents and evidence. Lilith sat at the defense table looking small and sad in a conservative dress, her hair pulled back neatly. She'd clearly been coached to appear sympathetic rather than threatening. The jury filed in and took their seats, 12 people who would decide whether to believe me or her. Beck stood and delivered his opening statement in a calm, measured voice. He described the night I recorded Lilith's confession and explained the evidence supporting each charge. He didn't sensationalize or make promises he couldn't keep. He simply laid out the facts and told the jury they would hear testimony from multiple witnesses who were there. Lilith's attorney gave his opening statement next, painting me as an unreliable addict trying to blame others for my problems. I forced myself to stay calm and remember that the evidence would speak louder than his accusations. After opening statements, the prosecution called me as the first witness. I walked to the stand and swore to tell the truth with my hand on a Bible. Beck started with basic questions about my background and relationship with Lilith. I explained how she married my father and became my stepmother when I was 15. We went through my history with addiction and the struggles I'd faced trying to get clean. Beck asked me to describe the night of my 1-year anniversary and what happened when Lilith arrived. I walked through the entire conversation, explaining how I kept her talking to make sure my family heard everything. The defense attorney's cross-examination was brutal and lasted over an hour. He hammered my addiction history and suggested I was making up stories to avoid taking responsibility for my failures. He pointed out inconsistencies in small details and implied I was an unreliable narrator. I used the grounding techniques Antonia taught me, pressing my feet into the floor whenever I felt myself getting defensive. I focused on answering each question with simple facts rather than getting emotional or argumentative. When he asked if I'd been high that night, I looked him in the eye and said no. I'd been sober for exactly 1 year. By the time I left the stand 3 hours later, I felt drained but steady. Detective Marston took the stand next and walked the jury through her investigation. She described executing the search warrant at Lilith's house and what evidence was seized. She explained the chain of custody for the pill bottle and how it was logged and stored. She talked about arranging for the exhumation of my dog's remains and sending them to the forensic veterinarian. The defense attorney tried to poke holes in her work by asking why certain leads weren't pursued. He questioned why some evidence took weeks to process and implied she'd been sloppy. Detective Marston handled the cross-examination professionally without getting flustered. She explained that resource constraints meant prioritizing the strongest evidence first. She noted that some tests required specialized labs with backlogs. She maintained her composure and stuck to the facts throughout 2 hours of hostile questioning. The forensic veterinarian testified on day 2 of the trial. She explained her qualifications and experience examining animal remains. She described receiving my dog's remains and conducting a thorough examination. She used careful language about what the evidence showed versus what could be stated with absolute certainty. The damage to the hyoid bone was consistent with strangulation. The pattern of injury matched what she'd seen in other cases of ligature strangulation. However, she acknowledged that decomposition limited how definitive her conclusions could be. The defense attorney pressed her hard on cross-examination about the word consistent. He got her to admit that consistent didn't mean proven beyond doubt. She agreed that other explanations were theoretically possible, though less likely. I watched the jurors' faces as she testified and saw sympathy and disgust. Several jurors looked at Lilith with obvious distaste when the veterinarian described the dog's injuries. That gave me hope they understood what she'd done. After 3 full days of testimony, both sides gave closing arguments. Beck summarized the evidence methodically and reminded the jury of what multiple witnesses had heard Lilith confess to. The defense attorney argued that the confession was coerced and my testimony was unreliable. The jury got the case at 2 in the afternoon and deliberated for 6 hours. We waited in a small room down the hall, barely speaking as the hours crawled by. Finally, the bailiff came to tell us the jury had reached a verdict. We filed back into the courtroom and stood as the jury returned. The foreperson handed a paper to the judge, who reviewed it silently. My heart pounded as she read the verdicts aloud. Guilty on the animal cruelty charge. Guilty on the attempted distribution charge. Not guilty on the poisoning-related charges that had less direct evidence. I felt a complicated mix of validation and disappointment wash over me. Beck leaned over and quietly reminded me that 2 felony convictions were significant and would result in real consequences. I nodded but couldn't shake the frustration that Lilith wasn't being held fully accountable for everything she'd done. Over the next 2 weeks, I worked with Judy to draft my victim impact statement for sentencing. We went through multiple drafts trying to find the right balance. I needed to convey the damage Lilith caused without sounding vengeful or hysterical. I described the year I spent believing I'd killed my dog in a blackout. I explained the health problems that continued to affect me because of her poisoning. I talked about the relationships that were destroyed by her manipulation and lies. Judy helped me cut anything that sounded too emotional or accusatory. Antonia had me practice reading the statement out loud until I could deliver it in a measured, powerful way. We worked on my pacing and tone so I'd sound credible rather than angry. The goal was showing the jury the real human cost of Lilith's actions without losing composure. The sentencing hearing happened 3 weeks after the verdict on a gray December morning. The courtroom was packed with family members and a few reporters who'd picked up on the case. Lilith's attorney argued for probation, claiming she had no prior record and posed no danger to the community. Beck countered with the severity of her crimes and the calculated nature of her actions. The judge asked if I wanted to read my victim impact statement, and I stood on shaking legs. I read slowly and clearly, describing how Lilith's cruelty had affected every aspect of my life. I talked about the guilt and shame I'd carried thinking I was responsible for my dog's death. I explained the ongoing medical issues from years of being poisoned. I mentioned the career I'd lost and the relationships that were damaged. When I finished, the judge thanked me and took a brief recess to consider the sentence. 30 minutes later, she returned and announced her decision. 18 months in jail with 3 years of probation, a permanent ban on owning any animals, a no-contact order extending beyond her sentence, restitution for my veterinary and therapy costs, but not for medical bills related to the historical poisoning. Beck leaned over and reminded me that jail time for these charges was actually significant. He said the felony convictions would follow Lilith forever and affect her employment and housing. I left the courthouse feeling steadied rather than triumphant, accepting that this was as close to justice as the system could provide. The probate attorney's office smelled like old paper and coffee. She spread the estate documents across her desk and tapped the injunction order with her pen. The court had frozen about 40% of my grandmother's assets pending a full hearing scheduled for 6 months out. She explained that proving undue influence was difficult but possible, especially with Lilith's fraud conviction now on record. The timeline stretched ahead like a marathon I hadn't trained for. Years, she said. Maybe I'd recover some of the estate, maybe not. At least Lilith couldn't drain everything while the case crawled through probate court. I signed the papers she pushed toward me and left, feeling like I'd just agreed to carry a heavy box for miles with no place to set it down. A month after sentencing, exhaustion hit me like a truck. I woke up one morning and couldn't get out of bed. My body felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The truth sat in my chest like a stone. My father and grandmother were murdered, and Lilith would never face real consequences for it. The system got her on what we could prove, but the worst crimes would stay unpunished. I called Antonia, and she fit me in that afternoon. Her office felt safe in a way nowhere else did. She listened while I talked about the rage and grief mixing together until I couldn't tell them apart. She said something that stuck with me. Justice is imperfect. Some wounds don't get the closure we hope for. That doesn't mean speaking up was wrong. It doesn't mean I failed. The system is broken in ways one person can't fix. I cried for the first time since sentencing, ugly crying that made my face hurt. When I left her office 2 hours later, the stone in my chest felt smaller, but it was still there. At my recovery meeting that week, I stood up when Seamus asked if anyone wanted to share. My voice shook when I said I had 13 months sober. The group clapped and a few people whistled. Seamus smiled at me from across the circle. He didn't pretend the journey had been easy or that I was fixed now. After the meeting, 3 different people came up to thank me. They said hearing about my commitment to sobriety during the trial inspired them. One guy said he almost relapsed during his divorce, but remembered my story and called his sponsor instead. I drove home feeling something close to proud. I survived everything Lilith did to destroy me and came out still fighting for my recovery. That was worth something, even if the legal outcome sucked. The hospital job offer came through 2 weeks later. It was a support role in the medical records department. Nothing like the nursing career I'd trained for, but it let me be near the medical world without the pain of what I'd lost stabbing me every day. The work was simple: filing, data entry, helping patients request their records. My supervisor met with me before my first shift. She knew about my history and criminal record. She said it directly. I hired you because I value second chances and you were honest on your application. Don't make me regret it. I promised her she wouldn't and I meant it. 3 months in, I was good at the job. Patients liked me. My coworkers treated me normal. Some days I walked past the nurse's station and felt the ache of what could have been. But most days I just did my work and went home grateful to have a paycheck and a reason to get up in the morning. The lawyer's office was smaller than I expected. He specialized in record expungement and relief petitions. I explained the assault charges and how they were based on Lilith's lies. He pulled up her fraud conviction on his computer and nodded. This helps your case significantly. But he was honest about the timeline. Multi-year process, demonstrating rehabilitation, lots of paperwork, no guarantees. The filing fees alone were more than I wanted to spend. He said we'd start with a petition to the court and see what happened. I signed the retainer agreement knowing this was another long fight ahead. At least I was fighting for something that mattered. Clearing my record wouldn't undo the damage, but it might open doors that were currently slammed shut. Uncle Julian called with updates about Sophie every few weeks. She started seeing a trauma specialist. She was doing better in the school, opening up more about her feelings, still having nightmares, still struggling with guilt about her mother. I kept my distance like we'd agreed, giving her space to process without pressure from family. But I texted her sometimes. Short messages letting her know I didn't blame her for anything. Telling her I was proud of her courage, asking how school was going. She rarely responded, but when she did, her messages were careful and kind. I hoped she knew she could reach out if she needed me. I hoped she was getting the support I never had at her age. One sunny morning, I drove to the spot where I'd buried my dog. The grass had grown over the grave and wildflowers were blooming nearby. I sat down and just stayed there for a while. For the first time since his death, I could grieve him properly without the crushing guilt. I knew the truth now. He died because of Lilith's cruelty, not because of anything I did. I took the old collar tag off my keychain and held it in my palm. Then I pulled out the new tag I'd had made. It was engraved with my 13-month sober date. I attached it to my keychain next to where the old one had been, a ritual that honored both his memory and my recovery. The guilt that ate me alive for a year had changed into sadness and anger at Lilith, but also gratitude. Gratitude that he'd been in my life. Gratitude that I finally knew the truth. I touched the ground over his grave and whispered that I was sorry it took so long to figure out what really happened. Family dinner happened at Uncle Julian's house. Everyone sat around the table and nobody pretended everything was fine. Aunt Natasha brought up the civil hearing scheduled for next month. We needed to coordinate who could attend. Uncle Julian pulled out the calendar we'd used during the trial, and we started planning the rotation system again. Some of the conversation got tense when people disagreed about strategy, but underneath it was trust we'd rebuilt through everything we'd been through together. My cousin asked how I was doing, and I gave her an honest answer instead of a polite one. Hard days and okay days. Still sober. Still showing up. She squeezed my hand across the table. After dinner, we sat in the living room and talked about normal things. TV shows and work drama, and whose car was making weird noises. It felt good to be part of something again instead of the family problem everyone whispered about. My life settled into routines over the following weeks. Work 5 days a week. Therapy with Antonia every Tuesday. Recovery meetings 3 times a week. Checking in with Seamus when I needed support. The civil case moved forward slowly. The expungement petition sat in a pile somewhere at the courthouse. Sophie was healing in her own time and space. I protected my sobriety above everything else because it was the foundation holding up everything else I was building. The outcome wasn't perfect. Lilith didn't face consequences for her worst crimes, but I was still here, still sober, still fighting. Some days that felt like its own kind of victory. I kept my eyes open to the reality that justice was incomplete and healing was ongoing, but I was moving forward instead of staying stuck, and most days that was enough. Well, that is the grand finale that nobody asked for. If you made it this far, you clearly have commitment issues in the best way possible. You might as well subscribe now. We are already in this mess together.